The 17th of December, 1944. The pre-dawn chill hung heavily over Hansfeld, Belgium, a frigid, silent witness to the sheer desperation of the German High Command. SS Commander Joachim Peiper stood among 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel, the gasoline cans scattered across a forward supply dump, abandoned by the retreating U.S. 99th Infantry Division. For a moment, a wave of profound relief and triumph must have surged through him, fueling a desperate hope for Germany's final, desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive, codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine. His elite Kampfgruppe Peiper, the tip of the spear in this audacious push, was composed of powerful, thirsty tanks like the mighty Tiger II, a behemoth that guzzled over 2 gallons of fuel for every mile it grudgingly covered. Peiper had begun the offensive with a critically low reserve, relying on capturing enemy fuel to complete his 65-mile objective. As his men rushed to siphon the captured liquid gold into their tanks, a chilling, stark realization set in, one that transcended tactical victory. If the Americans could afford to abandon this colossal amount of fuel, 50,000 gallons, without blinking, leaving hot coffee steaming in cups and fires still burning in oil drums, the war was already lost. Peiper had discovered not just a cache of gasoline, but the crushing, indifferent weight of American industrial power. The supply point at Hansfeld wasn't even a major depot. It was a quickly established forward dump, yet his officers correctly calculated that the Americans had abandoned more fuel in this single location than most German units received in half a year. This was not victory, it was a revelation. If the United States could treat such a quantity of essential material as entirely expendable, Germany was facing an enemy operating on a completely alien scale. The contrast with the German fuel situation was devastating. By late 1944, Germany's own synthetic fuel production had been utterly shattered, reduced by nearly 90% thanks to relentless Allied bombing of hydrogenation plants. The once proud Luftwaffe was permanently grounded. Vital training flights had been slashed to zero, and German civilians hadn't seen gasoline in years. Peiper's entire fuel strategy for the offensive was an act of desperation masked as military planning. His orders were stark. Engines off after 5 minutes idle. Capture fuel above all else. His survival depended entirely on the enemy's willingness to leave him what he needed. But the terrain and fierce resistance slowed the advance immediately. Narrow roads, muddy tracks, and stubborn resistance from a single U.S. platoon held Peiper up for over 10 hours. The heavy tanks sat idling, wasting precious, finite gallons, literally consuming the hope the fuel from Hansfeld had offered. Peiper pushed on, driven by the desperate hope of reaching a massive depot near Stavelot, rumored to contain 2 million gallons. But American engineers, following orders to deny the enemy at all costs, had already torched it. The sky filled with a titanic column of black smoke, a funeral pyre for the offensive's final chance. Similar scorched earth scenes played out across the Ardennes. In just 1 week, the Americans intentionally burned over 8 million gallons of petroleum rather than let it fall into German hands. Peiper watched the inferno in stunned silence. One of his weary officers reportedly muttered the simple, devastating truth, "They can afford to burn it. What are we doing here?" The Americans weren't operating near a supply ceiling. They were operating on an entirely different economic plane. Their logistical network, featuring the Red Ball Express delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily and petroleum pipelines stretching across France, was consuming over 1 million gallons of fuel a day, yet receiving even more. They were not running out. They were stockpiling. The logistical system supporting one American Army Group alone consumed more fuel than Germany's entire Army Group B was allocated in a month. Peiper advanced a few more agonizing miles, his tanks sputtering and slowing. The offensive finally ground to a halt, not because of overwhelming enemy fire, but because the tanks were simply dry. At L'Église, his most advanced position, the offensive choked to death. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that had begun the elite spearhead, only 39 remained, and not a single one could move. Surrounded by rapidly closing American forces, the desperate SS troops were forced to destroy their own magnificent vehicles, weapons designed for conquest, and flee on foot through the snow. What Joachim Peiper discovered at Hansfeld wasn't just a supply dump, it was the end of an illusion. The war was already lost, not through a lack of courage or a failure of tactical acumen, but through a brutal, insurmountable disparity in industrial capacity. Germany had elite soldiers and technologically deadly machines. America had factories, secure oil fields, and a logistics machine that could casually afford to burn millions of gallons of fuel just to win a single, isolated battle. By late 1944, the deciding factor in the conflict was not bravery or strategy, it was industrial scale. Germany had skill, but America had scale. The Battle of the Bulge was ultimately decided, not just in the freezing forests of Belgium, but in the distant oil refineries of Texas, on pipelines laid under the sea, and in endless truck convoys racing across the liberated lands of Europe.